So this is something that not a lot of people talk about when it comes to speaking in a second language. So it's not always your vocabulary, it's not always your grammar, and it's not even about your confidence most of the time. It's actually your bandwidth. And I don't mean your internet connection in this context. I mean it's your brain's processing capacity in the moment. So the mental space that is available for thinking, forming ideas, and responding in real time. So every conversation, whether it's in your native language or in your second language, it draws from it. And some conversation drains bandwidth faster than others. But once I show you, you're probably going to recognize it in every conversation you've ever frozen in. So a couple of nights ago, I was in a conversation with a group of friends, and I had two very memorable conversations then. So the first one was with a friend of a friend called Bob. So Bob is a chemical engineering graduate, and he was going very deep and very long about the intersection of science, mathematics, philosophy, and spirituality. And then he would just be talking nonstop for literally half an hour straight. My God, I actually get exhausted just thinking about that conversation right now. But basically, that friend group actually has a code word to get him to stop talking. So then there I was just following this dense, very fast-moving conversation about how science cannot really explain everything, about forces beyond what mathematics can explain, can capture. But then I was just sitting there, I had nothing to add. And not because I couldn't speak, but because keeping up with the depth of what he was talking about or where he was going, it was really taking so much of me. It was taking everything, a lot of mental effort for me to just follow him and to try understand the concept that he was talking about. So in other words, there was no bandwidth left for me to formulate a response. And then later that night, the boys left and it was just me and another friend, Lisa. I had another very deep conversation where we talked about self-development, about resistance in starting, about understanding yourself, about how the mind works. And at this time, I was the one who was yapping nonstop. Well, no, it was definitely a lot more balanced than when I was having a conversation with Bob. But anyways, everything I wanted to say just came out. Naturally, no effort. And it was the same person, me. It was the same language, English, and it was also happening all at the same time. But then the difference in how I was carrying myself and how I felt speaking it was drastic, the difference. Oh my God, my cat. Hey.
What is he?
So the easy explanation could just be that, well, I know the topic better when I was talking to Lisa. And that is partly true. But this is also what I noticed. With Bob, two things were draining my bandwidth at once. First, it was following where he was going. And two, it was monitoring myself. How am I coming across? What's the smart thing to say here? Oh, I can't just sit here looking blank, looking kind of dumb. Whereas with Lisa, none of those things were happening. So with Lisa, I was very present in the conversation and I wasn't thinking about how I would come across at all. So bandwidth is not just about how hard the topic is, it's also about how much of it you are spending watching yourself. So both things, they eat from the same limited resource. And then when the topic is unfamiliar and you are self-monitoring on top of that, the system just overloads. The system just crashes. Imagine doing that in a second language, where producing the words themselves, it already cost you a lot of bandwidth before the topic, before the self-monitoring even starts. And that is what we call the processing gap. And this is why we freeze. So this is what's actually happening when you are speaking in a second language. So in your first language, speaking is automatic, right? You don't even think about the words, they just come out naturally, which means almost all of your mental bandwidth goes to the actual content, the idea, the conversation. In English, in your second language, especially when it's under pressure, it's not automatic yet. So your brain is doing that extra work to just produce the language. There's word retrieval, there is grammar checks, there's pronunciation, and all of it was just running in the background. All of it was eating bandwidth. And then on top of that, you're also monitoring yourself. How do I sound? Oh, am I saying the grammar right? Oh, do I look confident? Is my accent okay? So you just overloaded the system. And then of course, something has to give. right? And what gives is fluency. And this is why you can speak perfectly fine about things that you really care about and then completely fall apart in high-stakes situations or about unfamiliar topics. So it's not really your English level that change, it's how much mental bandwidth that you have left over to reserve for actual speaking. And this is not a language problem, this is a bandwidth problem. So going back to the conversation that I had with my two friends, so with Bob, I was performing. So I was trying to seem smart. And that performance mode was eating my bandwidth. So even though technically I had things to say, my system was overloaded and nothing came out clean. Whereas with Lisa, I was communicating. I cared deeply about the ideas more than I cared about how I was coming across, about how I would be perceived. So all of my bandwidth was gone towards the content, towards the idea. And then the words just followed. So this is the shift that changes everything. Performance mode, you're thinking about yourself, how you sound, how you look, whether you are impressive enough. And that self-monitoring burns bandwidth before a single word leaves your mouth. Whereas communication mode, you take the focus away from yourself and into the content and also the other person. So what do they need to understand? What is the clearest way to say this? And how does this land? So almost no bandwidth is wasted on yourself. And the paradox is you actually sound better when you are in a communication mode, when you are not performing and too focused on yourself. Because this way, your brain is not splitting its resources anymore. And most native speakers have been trained to perform English, like pronounce it correctly or use the right grammar. You want to sound polished. And the reason why we are mostly trained this way is because how classrooms are designed. You know, like how we learn languages in the classroom is designed for you to pass exams or take the TOEFL or IELTS exam. So this performance mode is drilled in us. We need to sound perfect because we need to be great. We need to have a good grade. So that kind of training, as well intentioned as it is, it keeps you locked in the performance mode, which is exactly the mode that drains your bandwidth when it matters most. So I want to be specific about who I'm talking to right now. This isn't really for beginners, because if you're still building that basic foundation, that's a different problem for a different video. I am talking to you if you can already function in English, when you can already follow conversations, you can already speak, you write emails, and then you can get through meetings. But then something still feels off. You feel like you sound smaller than yourself, and then you go quiet even though you know you should speak up. You know what you want to say, but you're afraid that it comes out wrong, or it doesn't even come out at all. So the gap between what it is in your head and what actually comes out, that is what we call the processing gap. And it has nothing to do with how much English you know. It's a bandwidth problem. So how do we actually close this gap? There are three things. And all three work by reducing how much bandwidth speaking costs you. So the first is shifting from performance to communication in real time. The moment that you notice you are thinking about how you sound instead of what you're actually saying, you have identified the drain. So you want to name it. Oh, I'm in performance mode right now. And that awareness also starts freeing up your bandwidth. You cannot really force fluency, but you can stop spending resources on the wrong thing. And the second fix is practice with content that already lives in your head. So you don't want to do random exercises, not scripted sentences, but topics you genuinely care about. Something you read, maybe a problem that you're working through. So when you know the territory, the topic, your field very deeply and almost passionately, your brain spends almost nothing on content retrieval. So this freed up bandwidth goes into the language itself. Fluency gets easier not because your English improved, but because the cognitive load dropped. And number three is train inside the discomfort and not around it. So the processing gap shows up in real conditions, like unfamiliar topics, people you want to impress, or like stakes that feel high. And most English practice happens in safe conditions, like alone, no stakes. And these are actually really good to start with because this builds vocabulary, but it does not train your brain to manage bandwidth under pressure. You have to practice where the gap actually appears, where it's slightly uncomfortable and slightly unfamiliar. So consistently enough that your brain stops treating it as a threat. So the goal is not to never feel the pressure, but it's to have enough bandwidth left over that you can still speak through it. So the processing gap is real. It's more of a bandwidth problem, and this gap closes when you train the right way, in the right conditions, consistently. If this resonates, if you recognize yourself somewhere in this video, I actually built something specifically for this. This is called NaMi, or stands for Native Mindset, and it goes deeper into exactly why your brain works against you in English and what to actually do about it. The link is in the description, and if you have been carrying this feeling for a while, knowing that you are capable, but you're not being able to show it fully in English, that's not a you problem. That, again, is a bandwidth problem. And bandwidth can be trained. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.